Good morning, people. As you're all getting, welcome to our session as you're joining us. See some familiar faces here. We're going to be getting started soon. So as you can see in the chat, I've noted we're asking you to just remain muted for now while people are entering into the room and during the presentation. But we all encourage you to put your name and organization affiliation in the chat. So both you know who is in the room and we know who is in the room. We're looking forward to having a very robust discussion and a good group together. So we'll get started in just a minute or two. I'm muted. There we are. Now I'm unmuted. At least once a day. It wouldn't be a pandemic if I wasn't muted. So we'll be getting started in a minute or two, but thanks people for joining us. And as you're joining us, we just ask you to remain muted before we get started. But we encourage you to put your name and your organization affiliation in the chat as you're joining us. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to More Than Money, using organizational assessment to identify strengths and needs in the age of COVID-19, offered by the Massachusetts Community Foundation Partnership. I'm Jeff Poulos, the CEO of Philanthropy Massachusetts, and as you may know, the partnership is made up of 14 Massachusetts-based community foundations who've come together since the start of the coronavirus pandemic to pool resources to strengthen the nonprofit community. Philanthropy Massachusetts and the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network, and I'm joined today by Madeline Morgan from MNN, are pleased to work with the foundations to bring these resources to the Massachusetts nonprofit community. We're thrilled to be joined by Sandy McKinley of Sector Wind this morning. Sandy has been a long and valued asset in helping the nonprofit sector navigate strategy, think about finance. We are just so pleased to have her. She's a dear friend and colleague, and glad to have her here today. And even better yet, this is the first of 6 sessions that Sandy's going to be offering through this initiative. And so I'm delighted that she'll be joining us and leading these sessions. Before we get into this morning's session, I'm just going to go over some logistics. This session is being recorded, so if you, for any reason, miss a portion of it, we will be sharing out the recording. And also Sandy is going to share out the slides as well as an organizational assessment tool. She'll share that with us, and we will do as a follow-up sharing these materials as well as a link to the recording. We ask that you keep yourself muted during the presentation. I also encourage you to select active speaker view at the top of your screen so that the active speaker appears more prominently on your screen. If you have any questions during the part of the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat box for everybody to see, and Sandy, we can help Sandy keep an eye on that and lift up questions as they come up. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat box at any time. And just heads up about some of the sessions that are coming up. We have, I think, another 9 or 10 sessions so far on the calendar, and we'll be sending out links to register very soon. The first 2 in January are also being led by Sandy. Bringing the outside in, engaging communities in priority setting and planning is on January 12th at 10:30 a.m. And then a fundamentals of nonprofit finance, a financial boot camp, is on January 26th at 10:30 a.m. On the 27th, from 11 to 12:30, is organizational change to achieve equity, being presented by YW Boston. And on January 28th, from 1:30 to 3, is the alternative strategies for fundraising events, designing the event, by Alyssa Wright. So those are just a sampling of what's coming up, and those are January. We have a number in February, as well as some in March. So with all of that behind us, I am delighted to turn this over to Sandy McKinley. Thank you, Sandy, for being here.
Oh my gosh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much. So welcome everybody, and I appreciate everyone coming in on a Tuesday morning to spend some time together talking about using organizational assessment and helping us think through how we could move forward from the pandemic and thinking about our strengths and needs at this moment. I'm just going to. It always seems to not want to move. This first webinar kind of came about after a conversation that Jeff and I had, and when we were thinking about, when he was sharing with me, the results of a survey, which I'll talk about in a moment, and responding to the needs of the nonprofit community, and we were all asking at the time, what do nonprofits need? How do we identify those needs? But also, what do we kind of need to replenish? How have things changed? And also, what do we do first? And it also occurred to me recently that that the pandemic has been characterized as a storm, and that our organizations have been characterized as ships upon the storm. So there's no shortage of ship metaphors in the pandemic. So you think about good sailors are not made from calm seas, the African proverb that was co-opted by Franklin Roosevelt, or also things like ships were not made to stay in port, right? So thinking about us and thinking about this journey we have been on, how do we think about what is next, and what do we do first? How do we need to refuel? How do we come into harbor to replenish? And so that is really what is guiding our talk and our time together, and thinking about what do we do? How do we take stock? So I referred to this survey from the Community Foundation Partnership that happened earlier in the summer. And the team was really generous in letting me see kind of the results of that survey. And I was really struck by the multiple priorities that were identified. So over 1,000 folks organizations responded, and 70% identified partnerships as a need. Over 80% identified fundraising, all the areas of fundraising, as a need. 73% identified equity and inclusion as something that was a priority. 59, nearly 60% wanted help with program design. 70% recognized that they needed to do something to realign their strategic plan, and then over 60% wanted help with program design. So this raised the question, how do we think about what to do first? What are our priorities? And I not only do I work with nonprofits, not only have I worked with over 1,200 nonprofits over 20 years, I also sit on boards. I also volunteer with organizations, and I recognize the struggle sometimes in the multiple competing priorities that are raised at the table in what to do next, especially even in normal times. But what happens when we are under such compressed pressure as we have been in 2020? So what I'd like to do today is two things. One, to provide a little bit of context for what it means for us to plan for capacity building at this moment. And second, to really give just a rapid framework, evaluation framework that helps us identify and prioritize areas that might need investment and assistance. I want to call it, I don't want to call it a cheat sheet because I don't want to diminish it in any way, but I want to say that this is something that we can use within organizations for those who might be board members. I don't see this. I think this is something that is accessible. I want to give us enough of an overview so that it is informative. I don't want to bore you with step-by-step details because I believe that this is accessible enough for it to be self-directed. So I anticipate our time together to be about 45 minutes, but I am certainly happy to take questions. But just to set our context for today, for us to be together for about 45 minutes to go over this, and then to share the tool with you. So those were our goals for today, but my long-term aspiration for everyone is really two things. I am a consultant that is focused on strategic resilience and financial health, and by that I mean our ability to anticipate and in a way thrive in the never-ending fluidity of the operating environment while maintaining our vision for our organization's kind of long-term strategy, right? So how do we anticipate what's happening and make those adjustments in our fluid operating environment while maintaining our eyes on the prize, on our long-term prize? So that's what I mean by strategic resilience. And then also our financial health, having the types and amounts of money to cover the full cost of our operations while being able to handle risk and pursue opportunity, right? So that is really my long-term aspirations for the sector and for individual organizations that I work with. So when I'm thinking about everything that we do, I'm really having those things at the center, holding those things at the center. I like to start things because I know that there's like an alphabet soup of terms out there, and it's incredibly confusing even to me who's been in the sector forever. And thinking about organizational assessment, people could say, come on, Sandy, really, what does that mean? And it gets kind of bundled with impact assessment. It could be bundled with a number of different things. So just in a way for reference, but also just for clarity, what do I mean by organizational assessment? I'm going to start a little bit at the top, and you hear oftentimes organizational effectiveness. Sometimes we bristle when we hear that because we hear that frequently from funders, but that's really that kind of mega term that is used to capture the ability of our organizations to really fulfill its mission. How effective are we at delivering our mission? And frequently, we will be asked about this in our grant reports. We'll be asked about this in comparison to other organizations, but that is kind of our overall effectiveness on our mission. Organizational capacity, I think of this as, what can we carry as an organization? Do we have what are our skills, knowledge, and resources that we have in our organization to be effective? What is our overall capacity to engage? Assessment is really, it's in a way an active noun, right? It's the use of a process or an instrument to understand where we are at a moment in time. So what is our capacity? It's measuring something and identifies areas of strength or for areas for investment. And then finally, capacity building is internal or external to us that helps us build something that needs investment, right? To strengthen our ability to enhance our organizational effectiveness or build our capacity, right? So ideally here, the virtue would be that we can, our capacity building needs are informed by our organizational by an organizational assessment. Sometimes it's easy. We know that we need some technical assistance on Salesforce because we just got Salesforce, so we know that we need that technical assistance. There's a really good relationship there. But at times at times when we have multiple priorities or multiple capacity needs, so we can use an assessment to give us to provide a platform for helping us identify what those priorities are or discern perhaps a path forward. So how is assessment a little different, if you will, in kind of the current, what I'm calling the pre-post-pandemic era? I'm not quite ready to say it's the post-pandemic era because we're not quite there yet. Our goals are really to understand our strengths as much as we might need, as much as where we need to think about where investments need to be made. So we're thinking about where are we now as much as what do we need. We also must recognize that capacity is never static; it is ever changing, and we can think about this in our personal lives too, right? Like some days I just don't have the energy to make dinner, right? And sometimes our capacity as an organization, we might have had a capacity in the past to be able to do something, but right now, where we are and after what we have gone through in 2020, we no longer have that capacity, and that's okay. My point here is that we want to resist that temptation to immediately judge ourselves or immediately come in and just say, I have to fix this right now. But be able to be a little bit accepting and step back and just say, kind of it is what it is. I have learned over time that, and come to recognize the importance of and the beauty of the multiple perspectives in this discussion. I think that we say that multiple perspectives are great, but because of time or energy or convenience, we tend to still frequently end up with the usual suspects in these conversations. But I think it is worth the time and effort to find and seek out those who could provide different voices when we are thinking about what to do next. And that's for everything from community members, audience members, partner organizations, clients, and recognizing that, an assessment, even a short one like the one we're going to talk about today, not everyone will be able to complete all parts of it. That's okay. Even getting small pieces of input can be incredibly valuable. And finally, we're really aiming for a snapshot. It's a shared and fuller understanding of strengths and needs. It's not we're not aiming for a comprehensive and deep understanding of your overall situation. Recognizing what the intended goal of the tool and of the process is for is important. So as we think about when we are faced with a lot of data, when we're faced with a lot of priorities, I think we all know that it's really good to break things down. This is hitting home for me right now as my son is learning algebra, and so we are in our house doing a lot of breaking down of formulas, and also remembering a lot of algebra from eons ago. So I think that might be the theme of the first semester of this year for all of us in the McKinley household, is break it down. And the same is true for us as organizations. And this framework or rubric will not be unfamiliar to people because these frameworks exist everywhere. But thinking about our organizations, sometimes we think about it by department, we think about it by program, we think about it like via calendar, we think about it by reporting line. what I'm going to share with you is kind of how I think about like elements of strength and resilience of organizations. And you'll see a little kind of compass point in the middle here on the page. That is kind of what I say is our true north. And that's like our mission and vision. That's why we get up in the morning, right? So no one ever, like I work in finance, no one ever says, hey, I get up in the morning to think about finance, except for maybe me. But most of us who are in the nonprofit sector get up because we want to inspire people through art, or we want to think about serving our community, or working with children. But that compass point is our true north, and that's always at the center. But our organizations are made up of other things, both internal and external. The first is really like our programs and services, kind of what we do and how we do it. And that's kind of like pointing north, right? That's the work that we do. It's what we do and how we do it. Then it's like the people who do it, right? It's the people and culture, right? So it's those who do it, it's the staff, the board, the volunteers, but it's also the way in which it's done. And, I don't want to gloss over that culture, because we can have people, but if we have people who are burnt out, or we have a bad culture, that impacts the way in which we are, the work gets done, right? We then have, external to us are networks and relationships. So those can be people, groups, organizations. That's kind of our social capital, right? And we need that. None of us is an island. Our organizations exist in community, right? And I've never yet met an organization who can operate on it like completely on its own without external relationships. In here also falls, and we'll go into this in more detail, we think about fundraising. Fundraising can also fall into this relationship category. Next is what we kind of call systems and operations, right? That's everything from like technology, which is like just shown to be so important in 2020, but process and infrastructure and facilities, like places and systems and things and how we do it. And then finally, like this last piece of this little star is money and finance, the types and amounts of resources that we can access and how they're managed, right? Like that's that final piece of the puzzle. And that's really like surrounding and supporting our mission, our mission and community at the middle. So those are the ways that kind of I see and I kind of break down all of the elements of our organizations. That's how it's kind of we're holding it all together. And so with that, that's kind of that's the context. And I'm thinking about, how do we assess our organizations? How do we think about organizational strengths and needs as it relates to capacity building? The assessment I'll share with you and the process we'll go through breaks it down into these areas: programs and services, people and culture, relationships, systems, and money and finance. I recognize that these things kind of overlap. There are no perfect and neat lines. And again, that's okay. Some of the, I'll also note that that there's an internal and external thing going on here, right? So largely our programs and services are external facing. Our people and culture are both internal and external. Our relationships, are largely meant to be external, but we have our people are the ones who are making those relationships. Our systems and operations are largely internal, and our money and finance is largely internal. So also recognizing that internal external part of these elements can be helpful for some organizations. They'll say, we are great on the outside, though we look perfect to the world, but internally we are a mess. And so I just share that because if as you're going through the assessment, if you're going through your reflection, ask yourself, is this, is there an internal, external element or shade element that is going through your thinking? So I'm going to dive in. and go into each of these in a little bit more detail, and then give some tips and guidances for each of these. So, I'll give a bit of a definition and then give some guidance. Then we'll go through the process, and then I'll give an example and I'll take some questions. And then we'll go from there and wrap up. But first, to think about, like, what do we mean by programs and services? Like, what are we looking at when we're quote unquote like assessing programs and services? What are we double clicking into? So first, programs and services, we want to think about our ability to design, deliver, and improve programs that are informed and valued by our community, right? So that's intentional there, right? So our programs and services don't exist in a vacuum, right? They are meeting a need, hopefully a community need. So we want to look at, how do we develop our programs? How do we deliver our programs? And how do we know they're working, right? And there's no, and so we will reflect. We want to reflect on those three things. How do we develop them? How do we deliver them? Or, like, are we able to deliver them? And how do we know that they're working? In our current times, what I call, like, I say, recognize the difference between the balance between today and the before times. In reflecting on our organizations, it's important to think about what changes have had to be made, which ones are temporary and which ones are permanent. The clients I'm working with right now, there's a lot of question about, and I suspect that it's not unique, there's a lot of questions about which changes will go away, which ones will stay. And then if it's unclear, make a note, but I also find it helpful to keep asking why. Why was this change made? Why did this work? Why didn't it work? And really getting to the kind of underlying answer below the why. Also thinking about where program changes or uncertainty kind of either come into conflict or misalignment with previous strategic plans. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because I think right now we're all thinking about, like, we're all reconsidering strategic plans, and that's okay. I mean, but just again thinking about, okay, let's acknowledge that these actions weren't necessarily that we didn't foresee this in our strategic planning. That's okay. Did it work? Why didn't it work? What did we think? How did we design this? How did it come about? How do we deliver it? Where might we be taking this? How is it fulfilling that need in the community? Is our community valuing it? So I'll move on. The second is people. And in people, we talk about kind of our board, our leadership, so our executive team, and our staff's capacity to effectively enact our mission in a way that is aligned with our aspirations for our people, right? So that's thinking about, it's people and culture. So it's all of leadership and governance, which is a big, kind of a big subject area. But it's also staffing, it's the way we plan, and it's our culture and values, and especially those related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And for the purpose of this evaluation that I'm sharing with you, or this assessment that I'm sharing with you, it's abbreviated. I don't say it's abbreviated. It's an assessment that doesn't do a full assessment of your leadership and governance practices, right? This is an assessment of, we are emerging out of the pandemic, the pre-post pandemic era. So the questions around leadership and governance are very much related to the way the governance and the board is supporting in decision making at this moment, right? Or in these moments. There are other assessments that look very deep into leadership and government. That is not really the intention of this, so I'll say that up front. Staffing is looking at both staff as it relates to appropriateness and delivering programs, but also staff in relation to community and staff and staff in compensation and staff in capacity. And planning is thinking about leadership, executive leadership, and board leadership, and in a way ability to plan in this moment and plan into the immediate future of the next 6, 12, and 18 months. And thinking about what capacities are there, and then also into culture and values, and thinking about how that plays out in the organization at this moment, because we all know that there are a number of different factors and forces that are impacting us, both from the stress of COVID, but then also as a result of racial equity, Black Lives Matter, and really a much needed focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I'm just checking the chat. All right. Oops, sorry. So again, a couple of tips and viewpoints. Tips here. Multiple viewpoints. So I said this earlier. It is especially true that in staff and culture and people in culture, that multiple viewpoints really help to lift up how work gets done. So underlying strengths of an organization, as well as high priority needs. So our frontline workers are those who are really serving kind of our day-to-day clients, are incredibly valuable in this people and culture assessment. I mentioned before that equity, inclusion, priorities, strengths, and needs will arise in this discussion. So just a reminder to lead with generosity and grace. And just a reflection from experience, just resist the impulse for this exercise to be about individual performance. This exercise is not intended to necessarily name names or to call out in any way. This is really to look at an organizational level. If there's anything that around specific performance, I think we all know that those are conversations that should be held in different forums, not in a kind of a group exercise. Let's see. So moving next, so our relationships are really interesting, and there's a lot here. Usually when I'm working one-on-one with clients, and the initial impulses for folks to say, oh yeah, our relationships are great. And then when we dig into it, there's a lot more that is to uncover. So this is our capacity to develop and steward and maintain those relationships with the externals, both people, groups, organizations, governments that help to champion and support our mission. So that could be from people, right? Just advocates. It could be from our next door neighbors, formal volunteers, informal volunteers. It's our clients. They're part of like our relationships. It's our community where we are. It's peer organizations or just other organizations. But it's also our funding relationships and our kind of fund development efforts. It's also our social media and our communication plans, and it's our relationships if that's with depending on what your organization is and how it operates. If you have those government relations, either from a funding perspective or from like a regulatory or just relationship perspective, those are those external relationships. In a way, it's like that social capital. What is kind of your reputation in the community? It's also your credibility. And that is something that we can't necessarily put a value on, but it is incredibly valuable. And so in reflecting on this, we find that many of our organizations, when we think about strengths, we frequently will go straight to, well, they have great programs, or they have a great, they're really strong because they have a great reserve. They're financially healthy. But I always tell the story, or I always challenge folks to say, well, what about that small community-based organization that's been around for 40 years and that's absolutely anemic financially? But it's been around for 40 years and everybody knows it and everybody loves it. And don't tell me that that's not an organization that's sustainable, because it's been sustained for 40 years. It might not look financially healthy, but that community has sustained it for a very long time. And that tells me that that organization has a lot of community capital to it, and we can't discount that. That is a true strength of the organization. Doesn't mean that it doesn't have other, areas that need investment, but we cannot discount that relationship or that social capital or that community strength as a real power or an asset. So when we're looking at organizational assessments, the value of our relationships, or more importantly, absent strong relationships, is something that we need to pay attention to. And so, hold on, here we go here. Again, I think I hit most of these. Like, what is our role in the community? Do we have both the skills and the mindset to keep up these relationships, and who within our organization has those skills? And then also thinking about our strength, is it really fueled by volunteers, right? Are volunteers taking the place or substituting? Are they really providing program services? And that's okay, but let's just acknowledge that. And then also, do we have relationships with those who have access to the resources that can support us financially, right? Like that ability to gain resources is built on relationships. And so thinking about building that strength. I'm going to move to systems and operations, right? And this is like, sometimes folks think this is the boring side of things, but it's the stuff that is, I think, in 2020 showed us, how some organizations can quickly pivot, and when it's not there, it's missed, right? So it's everything from recruiting, retaining, and training our qualified staff, right? How do we bring people in, on board quickly, and keep them there and engaged? It's also making sure that we have the technology and software to do our jobs. We can work in physical spaces that are safe and well maintained, and that we can safely gather, retain, and learn from our data. So it's human resources, infrastructure, IT, facilities, and then data and learning. This all sounds very formal, but it doesn't have to be, right? It doesn't have to be hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment. It has to be, it can be Excel spreadsheets and process it, and very simple processes. It just has to be in place. So it's a matter of reflecting on how do you do it, and is it being done? It's not a matter of what shiny object is doing it. It's more of how is your organization doing it, or is it not doing it? And then what is the cost or the impact of it not being done? So this is coming up a lot, like I said, from the before times, right? Because technology has become so much a different part of our lives. Infrastructure, people always ask what infrastructure means. It's the tangible property that we need to do our jobs. And then just talking about, why human resources is here. It's a process to recruit, retain, and train a team. If we don't do that, we can't we can't deliver our programs, right? Like we are people serving people organization. We are typically people serving people organizations, and human resources is a system or an operation that supports us being able to live out our mission. So that's why we put it in systems and operations. I'll move to our last section, which is money and finance, right? The capacity to access and plan. So it's those two things, access and plan for the types and amounts of money or financial resources to cover the full cost of our day-to-day operations and ensure that we can handle risk and pursue opportunity. So that's the aspiration. But what we're looking for is like, can we, what is our operating performance? What are our measures of liquidity? What kind of cash, what cash do we have on hand? Can we predict that? What is the health of our balance sheet, right? What do we own? What do we owe? And what do we really own as far as like our net assets? Can we project and budget? And do we have access to clear, accurate, and timely financial data? Right. So can we access our financial information in a timely way, in a way that is clear and easy to understand? My big disclaimer here is that most nonprofits don't even have 3 months of cash on hand. And this is prior to like people getting PPP. But so just acknowledging that that the rest of the world isn't super rich, right? The sector as a whole is underfunded, under-resourced, and undercapitalized, and the pandemic has made this worse. But it is, my strong belief and my experience that we have to, as organizations, it is in our best interest to kind of tell truth to ourselves and own our financial story in a way that is unapologetically accurate, and to do so, we have to be able to really advocate for the types and amounts of money that we need to deliver our services to our community. So I work with money. I work in finance every day. I like to say I work in finance every day, but I kind of grew up in as a classics and theology major, and then came into finance and the financial side of things. So I know that it can be hard, but we are, but as a sector, it is in our best interest to really embrace the finance and the financial conversation. And I think that looking at this assessment and digging into the dynamics of our financials can really help for us to advocate for what we need and the types and amounts of dollars that we need to cover our costs and better serve our communities. Okay, there we go. So in this last part, we'll talk a little bit about using the assessment. So it is an internal exercise. It does not need to be shared outside the organization. It is intentionally, like many assessments, designed to slow down and challenge your thinking. So the questions are counterfactual. So what does your organization not do? So it's going to ask you, what don't you do? And it's going to ask you if what you don't do is true. So there are no right or wrong answers. And it's really going to seek, I encourage you to seek to understand where you are. There is no judgment. When I work through these assessments with organizations, I say listen, there is no judgment. I have seen organizations that have said, have answered true to the vast majority of the statements on the assessment. There is absolutely no judgment. It is just a matter, we were just looking to understand. So our process is, I want to make it pretty straightforward in doing the self-assessment. First, just identify some people. I suggest 2 to 3 people from the organization, and then consider 3 other people. Could be 3 external stakeholders or community members who might be helpful. 6 is a nice group to work with. I love working with a group of 6. And so, but if you could do half and half, 3 people from internal to the organization, 3 people from adjacent to the organization, that's great. But if it's 6 people from internal to the organization, then make it from a diverse, like a group, from across the organization, people who might not always get to participate in things like this. Second thing to do when you prepare, book a date. Set yourself a deadline and book a date. Book it for 1 to 2 hours. I don't want this, everybody is really busy. So book a date and set 1 to 2 hours. And then take the assessment. It should probably take you about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. You know, score, you're gonna answer yes or not applicable, or you're gonna skip a question or a statement. And feel free to skip those. Tally your answers. And then you're going to reflect. You're probably going to make some notes, and I would encourage you to do so. And then you're going to come together and again, seek to understand each other's perspectives. You're going to address differences of opinions. See it as a way to just, if there's differences of opinions, figure out why. And then kind of share the key findings and conclusions internally with board and staff. And through that, you will be able to see what will bubble up kind of your priorities. So what does this look like? So the assessment is divided into 5 sections, into the 5 sections that we talked about. This is small, I know, but when you get it, it will be larger. And there are anywhere between 9 and 12 statements / questions per section. So it's not very long. And each question will ask you to respond, is this true or not? And so it will say, you know, I will take one question, you know, our new programs are always created in response to funding opportunities rather than community need. So I'd like you to think about that. So our programs are always created in response to funding opportunities rather than community need. And so, gosh, well, it's really asking me if I'm chasing money or I'm not chasing money. And so to really reflect on that. So if that's true, you would say true. If it's not true, you would just leave it blank. And then you will go and you would make some notes and say, well, maybe it's sometimes, but is it always true or sometimes true? And you would make some notes. And then just kind of work through the questions. By the end, you will have, you know, a tally of all of your truths. And that will, the instructions will tell you about how to score it. The score doesn't really mean anything. It's not a black box, but it will show you that if perhaps in programs and services, you have a really high score, that might give you an indication that your programs and services are maybe the first place you should look and have and guide your conversation. Your reflection and discussion after you come together will just orient around your sections. You reflect on your sections, your statements, where you agree and disagree. And I'll say that the statements are specifically designed to be transposed and advocate for any type of capacity building that might be needed. So for example, you know, a statement is, it's unclear if our programs are relevant to the needs of our community and or client base post-COVID. If everyone in your group, you know, says, gosh, you know, that's really true. That's like a thing of ours. But that's designed to say, okay, we can say with surety that we need assistance determining which programs are relevant to the needs of our community after we fully reopen. And that's a more specific way of us asking for a specific, for a type of help, right? A type of assistance. That's a need that we have. And so when we might be talking with our board or a funder or somebody who might help us with some technical assistance, we've already like specified, or we've already focused, we already had a more focused conversation of that need, and we can dig into that conversation with a little bit more depth with whomever we're speaking. So this might be helpful to see if I use an example. And so I'm using an example that happened that of a client that I worked with right prior to the pandemic, and they're actually kind of a really it's a great client. So I love them. So they have a really nice story post pandemic. So I decided to use them. They used a different but similar. They obviously didn't use the post pandemic assessment, but this is an organization that kind of a mid-sized community out of school time program. They kind of the typical in the school did after school programs, tutoring, did like vacation week programs, some before school programs, some like summer camps, that like sports programs, like that type of the program. And pretty successful. And it was kind of struggling pre-pandemic. And they were kind of referred to me, and they asked for help because they were always kind of falling short. And they thought they just needed like assistance with fundraising. And I'm not a fundraiser, but they just needed some help like focusing. And I'm good with helping people focus. So I asked them to take an organizational assessment. I said, listen, why don't you think through this? And they did they took it to heart. And so they asked board members, the executive director, their teachers, and their staff to take the full assessment. And they did. And they were, and I will say too that I put teachers and staff because teachers and staff, or the teachers and the frontline workers, were two specific and different groups. So that was, I'll just make note of that. And the following statements kind of emerged after our conversation as their priorities. So, which was really interesting. Now, remember, they came and said, we need fundraising. These were like universal across the board. Our new programs are always created in response to funding opportunities rather than community need. So that was the one I shared with you before. Organizational decisions are sometimes not reflective of the mission, vision, or strategy, and it causes distraction or confusion. Okay. We have too many priorities. We don't have enough capacity, or our staff is too thin to do all our work. Okay. Fundraising is not seen as communication, public education, and a way to reinforce program. It's seen as a means to an end. This surprised me, coming from an organization that said to me when coming in that they were always falling short and they just needed to do some fundraising. These were the four things that were lifted up because of the organization assessment. Again, coming from board, executive staff, executive director, teachers, and frontline workers. So for me, as somebody who's coming in as a consultant, and remember, my work is really in strategic resilience and financial health, we dug into this and said, well, kind of what's going on here? I'm not necessarily going into all the details, but what I will share with you is kind of what happened, or kind of the discussion. What we learned was that there was a big disconnect about kind of intention or what people were doing between the board, the professionals, the executive director, and the staff, right? The board really, at the time, really thought that the programs were more kind of babysitting and didn't necessarily have the depth of I don't know, research and professionalism that they did. The executive director was really so busy and overwhelmed that it came off to the staff as uncaring and insensitive. There was the teachers were understaffed, and so the frontline staff felt like there was like just there was like a constant struggle because that there was never just time for reflection or peer-to-peer sharing or education. But when you got down to it, when you had that conversation, there were a lot of assumptions. There's a great respect for each other's role and work once there was a bit of a greater understanding. But there was also a underneath it all, there was deep care for the community and also deep personal connections to the children and also to the family and the family members. And so when you dug into it, within like 2 hours, you realized that when you put people and you got them together in a room when they were not distracted by the pressures of the day-to-day, that there was, in a way, a lack of capacity for this organization to look at each other and just have some very human connections. Second thing that we realized is that there was a general discomfort with money. And fundraising in particular. There was also a lack of capacity, not just of time, but of skill in budgeting and also in general managing money. There wasn't anything awry. Nobody was doing anything wrong. It was just that it wasn't their thing. And everyone thought it was somebody else's job. And there was no time to plan. Everything was on the fly. So that was really interesting. Again, remember what they asked for was help in fundraising. So they had some money that was they had a generous subsidy from a funder, and here was their decision and what they decided to do. They actually decided to engage staff, teachers, and the board and part of their community in really understanding what their programs were. They had so many programs in name, but programs in reality were about half. And so they decided to take time together on a weekend and essentially reconfigure their programs and streamline kind of their program array, their program architecture, so that they could be able to, that everybody would understand what was going on, and aligned kind of the economics, like be very transparent about the economics and what things cost. I'll talk about the pandemic in a second. They also decided to invest in the team, and because they realized that they had a people problem, and more of a cultural problem. And they decided that they were going to craft a real clear budget and an operating plan, not a strategic plan, an operating plan that was posted in the break room, that was shared with staff and updated regularly and had accountability measures. Because for them, it was all about communication and transparency. So this organization, the pandemic hit, and when the pandemic hit, they were quickly able to pivot. They became one of the essential worker centers for people like doctors, nurses, first responders, people who had childcare needs. They were able to get a space to deliver essential childcare services to essential workers, and get the special license and to be a contractor to deliver that. So they, and then staff that they couldn't keep on, they were able to, because of their community connections, were able to, in a way, second those staff to another community organization to assist with pandemic relief. So in a way, they're kind of a happy outcome. I don't know that this organization would be able to do that had they not really taken the time to go through and reflect. But that's my, we only have a certain amount of time together today, but I did want to just share with you that one very clear example of how one organization took an assumption about what was needed, really engaged with staff, lifted up 4 areas, and then asked their team to identify more what was needed, and then reinvested, again, more of an internal exercise, and then really pivot, and kind of take that and invest in their own capacity. So with that, I believe that is my formal end, but I am happy to, of course, take questions. Oh, goodness. But I will.
While Sandy's doing that, I'll
Oh.
say, first of all, thanks, Sandy, so much. And also, I encourage people to either put the question in the chat or use the raise your hand feature, and we can call on you for your question. And we've got some time left here with Sandy, so
Yep.
take full advantage of her deep knowledge and experience here. Throw your questions into the chat or feel free to raise your hand. There's one, Sandy. How long does it take to do the assessment?
Yeah, so individually, I would give yourself about an hour and a half. Like I said, there's about 50 questions or 50 statements that I'd like you to reflect on. Not all of them will be applicable to you. And so it depends how much you want to write and reflect on in your notes, but I would give yourself an hour and a half. And then my recommendation is that you bring the group together for 1 to 2 hours to do the group meeting.
Sandy, as you think about your experience in using this tool, are there some challenges that people stumble upon or are met with when they're using the assessment that come to mind?
It's, I think the, I think as a facilitator, right, that the hardest thing is that we always get defensive when we're reflecting and because it feels very judgmental, right? So it's so it's trying to take a step back to say, can we hold this mirror and just hold it as a reflection and not as a judgment, right? So that's I think that's the hardest thing that we can the hardest stumbling block, and to say that the hardest thing in the room when you're having a conversation is if one person says, no, we never do this, right? That this is, but other people are like, yeah, we do. It's going to be just so having that, being able to broker that conversation, and especially if somebody is very spirited about their position. So thinking about who you're choosing to have in that room and making sure that you have someone who is a good peacemaker, right? And skilled, a skilled conversationalist.
So Janet asks, how can you best use this assessment tool during strategic planning?
Right. So strategic planning, that's a great question. This is really thinking about capacity building. There are some questions there about strategy, and thinking about, do you, where does an organization, how to put this, it doesn't it could say, one, it could say, are you ready for a strategic plan, right? And two, where it could kind of point you in the direction of kind of, in a way, where to focus first, right? Like I said, I work with in finance and like strategic resilience. So I don't do strategic planning per se, like I'll do strategic visioning. But what I do, so I frequently work at the beginning or the end of strategic plans. And so I see this tool as something that can help you identify if you're ready for strategic planning, if that's the right thing for you, or if there's other things that have to happen prior to it, right? Because if you're not able to, if you don't have a board that is engaged, are able to make decisions, then perhaps strategic planning it's not the right time for strategic planning, because it might not be a really fruitful process if you don't have a leadership team, including your board, that is able to fully engage and be present.
How often do you recommend an organization revisiting an assessment?
Yeah.
As the business changes, annually, or is it needed, or what do you say?
Yeah, so these things are, that's a great question. These things are definitely iterative and ongoing. I would say once a year. You know, I would do it with your budget, around your budgeting process.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
Let's
uh,
see.
you can see there's one about are you available to meet with organizations?
Yeah, so if you have any questions, just email me. That's absolutely fine. Yep.
And
Yeah.
then as a nonprofit, Jamie says, being shorthanded or wearing multiple hats is just what happens. Suggestions when staff have concerns with this. Hiring can't always be the answer.
So being shorthanded and wearing multiple hats is not what happens. Hiring can't always be the answer. So I think my question is, it's just what happens.
Well, do you
Yeah.
think
So go ahead.
it has something to do with as you do your assessment, you have to balance the resources that you have or you have access to
Right.
with your vision and your goals and your programming. So like you may be, I think you talked about in your example one instance where an organization had like was only doing 50% of the programs that they said they were doing or something.
Right. Right. So there's always a choice, right? Because strategy is about choice, right? And so if you have an organization that is short-staffed, you can't always say yes, right? So and so that's on the executive director as much as it is on staff, right? To say, yes, that sounds like a great idea, but and who's going to do the work? Because either we don't have the budget to do the work or we don't have the capacity to do the work. And if we're asking our staff to do more work, we risk losing them, especially in a tight job market, so I think that that's what Jamie, I think that's what you're getting at, is it? So it's really about choice.
Mm.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Other
Yes,
questions, yeah.
Jamie says yes, thanks.
Yeah. Great.
Comments, questions?
Yeah.
Well, Sandy's given us her contact information, which is also in the slides, and so we will be sharing out the slides. We'll be sharing out the assessment tool. Let's all meet back here in a year to see what we've done. Jay throws a comment up here: because of Zoom developing relationships outside of community, which was not our initial mission, local potential collaborators are more self-centered. Our initial focus has been to develop local programs. At this point, we can handle growth as long as it is measured and planned. Should we consider expanding our mission outreach?
I think that's a great question. This is not the first time I've heard this. Like, I'm getting a lot of the same question from like our community music centers, and places that have like just found new audiences all over the place. I would say it's a great time to experiment. And my advice has been to say give yourself a time frame to see if it works, and give yourself an opportunity to give yourself either a time, give yourself your own parameters. So you can say, we're going to explore branching out beyond our local community, and we are going to dedicate this many resources to it, or these types of resources for this amount of time, and this is what we expect to get out of it. Where mission creep happens is when those parameters aren't set at the outset, right? And so that is my advice, and ensuring that, making sure that you can do that too, that you have the capacity to do it.
And sometimes, Cindy, I wonder if there's a trade-off too for what the impact is if you go beyond your original mission of local.
Right.
Now that you're more accessible, what do you lose?
Right.
What do you gain? And so
Right.
there's those kinds of questions to ask yourself.
That's
Right?
exactly right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So
Great.
it's worth, yeah,
Well,
great.
again, thank you so much, Sandy, for all of your knowledge and experience and sharing this as a tool. Again, as I said, we're going to be sending this out to people. We will include the recording, the slides, the tool, and we will be sharing out with you information about upcoming programs. So keep an eye for a listing of future programs for January, February, March, and April. And also through your community foundations, which the Massachusetts Community Foundation Partnership is the sponsor of these programs. And so you keep, certainly, keep an eye on what they're sharing out as well. So thanks so much, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.